Did you ever notice how Magnus Carlsen's attacks seem to come out of nowhere? I mean, he plays the opening, so passively sometimes it's really hard to imagine. And then all of a sudden you're looking at his games and then you're like, where did this come from? Well, this is a game as an example of that, right? This is in the Speed Chess Championship. This was his match against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, we call MVL for short. 5 minutes for each side with a 1 second increment. And I'm going to need you to tell me, where does this attack come from? It's really quite amazing. Magnus has white, MVL has black. Magnus begins with d4, and MVL plays knight f6, knight f3, and g6. One thing about Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, he's sort of a throwback to the Kasparov era. He plays all the critical main lines. He likes to play the Najdorf. He likes to play the Grunfeld. Really sharp, heavy, heavy, heavy theory. And Carlsen likes to do a little bit differently. So here he plays the move knight b to d2, trying to get out of theory. Here, if Lagrave plays bishop to g7, then e4, and you have a Pirt's defense. So to prevent that, MVL plays d5, which is the typical Grunfeld move, and it keeps e4 under control. So now b3, again, Carlsen is playing some odd moves, not too common, sort of a Kali-Zukertort formation. The bishop can go to b2, the knight can go to e5, bishop g7, bishop to b2, and now bishop to f5. He says, well, if you're not going to develop the bishop, I'm going to contest this important f5, d3 diagonal. e3 is played, castles, and bishop to e2. Now just look, Carlsen's completely developed, but his pieces are very unambitious. It almost looks like he's playing an opening from the black side. He's not trying to put any early pressure at all on MVL. He says, I'll get the pressure later, sort of his thinking. A knight to e4. It clears the diagonal of this bishop, opening it up, and gets a pair of pieces off the board. Castles, and now c5. A very strong move from MVL. Taking advantage of the pressure of this pin along this long diagonal and putting pressure on white's d4 square. I think it's fair to say that MVL can be very happy with how the opening has gone for him. So here, knight to e5 was played. A better scoring move for white is to take on e4, and after, say, d e4, knight e5, and white scores very well from this position. But Magnus plays knight to e5 right here. And here, knight to c6 was played, and we can see MVL putting a lot of pressure on white's position. He has knight development, a nice development, excuse me. And Carlsen takes on e4 with his knight. This is the novelty of the game. Before knight takes knight had been played, also the aggressive g4 was played, although it didn't work out for that player. But Magnus goes ahead and just takes on e4, bishop takes e4, knight c6, bc6, and c3. Again, passive. He blocks in his bishop, just solidifies the d4 pawn. I guess he's just anticipating he's going to be able to outplay MVL later in the game. Queen to a5, a4 gaining space. MVL takes on d4, and here Magnus could have just taken on d4. It would have given him a target on c6 and a hole on c5. He would have been certainly okay there, but instead he plays b4 first, an intermezzo, gaining space by hitting the queen. The queen moves back to b6, now a5, and queen to b8. And he's gained this space, but it's actually debatable whether or not that was a good idea, because there's a lot of pressure from black on these three pawns, and MVL might be able to make some headway there. C takes d4, and here Lagrave plays queen takes b4. Computers point out a really strong move that looks impossible at first sight, the move c5, but it's taking advantage of two pins, the queen's pin against the bishop and the bishop's pin against the bishop. So c5 would have actually been a very strong move here, but MVL takes the pawn with this idea. Magnus plays bishop to a3, hits the queen, and then the e7 pawn is on the other side. But MVL retreats the queen to b7 to defend the pawn. Queen to d2, with the idea of eventually shifting the rook to b1. He can't do that yet because the bishop controls b1, but maybe later he can do that. Rook f to c8, and now a6. Now this pawn is going to be a real problem for black. This is a nice space advantage, and the b7 square is going to become a nice landing spot for a white rook later, if he can get one there. Queen goes to c7, and now f3. Now he begins to push the bishop back, bishop to f5, and g4, gaining space and also gaining access to the b1 square by pushing the bishop away. The bishop goes to e6. Now rook a to b1. threatening to come in on b7 and cause all kinds of havoc. So MVL challenges that rook immediately, and bishop to c5. So for the sacrifice of a pawn, Carlsen has gotten very nice position with a lot of pressure on black. So here, the best move for black probably is something like bishop to d7. That's what computers recommend. The problem is that's just a passive, planless move. And human beings have a very hard time making moves like that. You want to do something, right? You want to put pressure on your opponent somehow. So MBL plays the move h5 to challenge this g4 pawn and maybe open up some potential on the king side. But that probably isn't the best move, and it really is going to lead to some weakening of the black king. First, Carlsen just takes the pawn. Then MVL plays bishop to f5, hitting the rook at b1. Another idea, which isn't too bad, was bishop to h3. And when that rook kicks away, gh5. And maybe, you know, there might be ideas of king h8, rook g8, putting some pressure on the king that way. But he plays bishop to f5, hitting the rook at b1. And the bishop goes to d3 to block the bishop. He wants to keep his rook on b1. And here, MVL plays the pawn break he's wanted to play from the very beginning, and that's e5, really attacking white's center. There's a problem, though. The problem is black's king is going to be too weak, and this move actually opens up lines of attack against black's king. So it's the pawn break you want, but at the wrong time. So pawn takes pawn, bishop takes bishop, fg6, and now we begin to see MVL's king is getting a little too much fresh air. He wants to go back inside. He didn't want to be outside with the fresh air. And queen to g2, immediately attacking the g6 pawn. By the way, if you're getting value from this video, please hit the subscribe button and become a subscriber for future videos. So MVL has to defend that pawn. Queen to f7. Magnus takes on e5. The idea is that when black takes the pawn back, which he does with this bishop, now f4. Using this f-pawn as a potential battering ram, he gains a tempo against the bishop on e5. So bishop goes back to g7. He needs to block this file so there's no pin on the g6 pawn. And now Magnus could play f5. And if MVL just retook, then after king h1 with the threat of rook to g1, Magnus would be totally dominating. However, what MVL would do instead most likely is rook takes b1, distracting that rook away, and then queen takes f5. And black, of course, would be fine in this position. So Magnus plays a really brilliant move here. He plays the move queen to g4. This puts direct pressure on the c8 rook. So he's threatening rook to b7, which would hit the queen, and the other rook couldn't take it because queen takes rook check, and he would win a whole rook. So he's threatening rook to b7. This is a very powerful move, queen to g4. So MVL moves his rook out of the way of that pressure. Rook takes rook, and now f5. And now the rook on f1 is guaranteed to be behind the f-pawn, and now white has real serious pressure against black's king. Pawn takes, rook takes f5, rook to b1 check, king g2, rook to b2 check, now king to h3. And we see black doesn't have any more checks in this position, so he's putting a lot of pressure on black. MVL plays queen to c7, obviously a very serious threat of queen to h2 mate. However, there is a death blow with this next move from white. White has a very, very powerful move here. Can you see it? That's right. He plays the move rook to f8 check. The bishop at g7 cannot capture the rook because it's pinned by the queen, and the bishop defends the rook. And in this position, MVL resigned. He's actually busted. His king is totally busted. And here's what would happen. King to h7, which is forced. Queen to h5 check. And then bishop to h6, blocking that check, which is also forced. Queen f5 check, king g7, queen f6, king h7, rook to h8, mate. Out of nowhere, a brilliant attack from Magnus Carlsen. Now, even after going over this great game for Magnus, there is still some great chess you're missing out on. To fix that problem, believe it or not, the key game you're going to want to look at is this game right here. So be sure to watch that next for some really mind-blowing chess.